Lucas Gray wasn't the kind of man who made noise. After 2 decades of acclaim as a celebrated painter in San Francisco's elite art circles, he quietly disappeared from the spotlight, longing for peace after a painful divorce and the slow death of inspiration. All he wanted now was solitude, nature, and a place where the only thing moving faster than the wind was the brush across his canvas. That's why he bought 5 acres of land on the edge of a town called Brookstone Ridge. A quiet, picturesque suburb nestled between rolling hills and pine trees. The property was slightly overgrown, but the view from the ridge was perfect. Open sky, clean air, and not a single skyscraper in sight. There was even an old barn he could convert into a studio. Lucas didn't know much about the town's homeowners association, and frankly, he didn't care. His property, according to every document he signed, lay outside the boundaries of the HOA-controlled neighborhood. He'd checked twice, but Karen Whitmore, president of the Brookstone Ridge HOA, believed differently. It started subtly. The day after Lucas moved in, a polite but condescending letter appeared in his mailbox. It welcomed him to our shared community and reminded him that all residents are expected to maintain visual consistency. The letter was signed Karen Whitmore, HOA president, in thick floral cursive. Lucas raised an eyebrow. Shared community? He wasn't in the HOA. He brushed it off. 2 days later, he was organizing the interior of his barn when a silver SUV pulled up to the end of his gravel driveway. Out stepped a woman in her late 50s, immaculately dressed in beige slacks and a pastel blouse. Her posture screamed authority. "Mr. Gray?" she called out. Lucas wiped his hands on a rag and stepped outside. "Yes? I'm Karen. HOA president. Just wanted to drop by and ensure everything's settling nicely." "Your fence line is interesting." Lucas followed her gaze toward the rustic wood fencing along the west border. "It's been here for over 30 years, he said. "I was planning to restore it." Karen's smile tightened. "It's just that the HOA prefers white vinyl fencing. It reflects better, matches the neighborhood aesthetic." Lucas replied calmly, "I'm not part of the HOA." There was a pause. "Well," Karen said with a smile too tight to be real, "boundaries are tricky in these parts. Things shift, lines blur." That night, Lucas walked the entire perimeter of his property, flashlight in hand, and compared it to the official county records he had downloaded. Everything matched. His land was legally separate from the HOA. Still, something about Karen's tone unnerved him. The next week, a pair of HOA landscapers entered his property and began trimming a patch of trees near his eastern edge. When confronted, they said they were beautifying community space. Lucas had to physically show them his deed before they left, reluctantly. Then came the sign. 3 mornings later, Lucas stepped outside to find a metal stake planted near his front gate, holding a white sign with the HOA logo. It read, "Notice, this property is subject to Brookstone Ridge visual and structural regulations." Lucas stared at it, stunned. He hadn't received any notice. No legal warning. No letter. Nothing. He removed the sign and tossed it in his shed. That evening, he received a notice of noncompliance, citing unapproved fencing, non-standard exterior paint colors, his barn was red, and unauthorized outdoor structures. The kicker? A fine totaling $200. He almost laughed. Almost. But Lucas wasn't the type to ignore red flags. He wasn't just a painter. He was also a man who once lost everything because he trusted the wrong people. And now, the same feeling that haunted him during the collapse of his marriage crept back in. Something was deeply, intentionally wrong here. When a retired surveyor from the neighboring town, an old man named Ellis, stopped by to admire Lucas's landscaping, he let something slip. "You know," Ellis said, glancing toward the HOA boundary. "This isn't the first time they've tried to stretch the lines. A few years back they did it to a widow up the hill. She moved out, lost most of her land. Karen's got the board wrapped around her finger." Lucas didn't reply. But in his mind, something clicked into place. They weren't just bluffing, they were playing a long game, and they had no idea that this quiet artist had just picked up a different kind of brush, one that would redraw the lines completely. The days that followed felt like a subtle siege. Lucas began to notice small things, out-of-place tire tracks near the east side of his property, HOA trucks parked just beyond his fence line, and an ever-increasing number of reminders being slipped into his mailbox. They were always worded politely, of course. Karen made sure of that. But underneath every line was the same message. You're not welcome here, unless you play by our rules. One morning, Lucas received a certified letter. This time, the message was far less polite. The letter stated that according to a revised zoning interpretation, a 0.6-acre portion of his property now fell under the Brookstone Ridge HOA's jurisdiction. The document included a grainy black and white map, poorly copied and riddled with confusing boundary lines, and an invitation to attend an HOA compliance review the following week. Lucas sat at his kitchen table, rereading the letter 3 times. The phrasing wasn't just misleading, it was deceptive. He pulled out his original deed, the county zoning map, and the certified survey he'd already reviewed with a local inspector. Everything proved that his land was fully independent. He wasn't just being harassed, he was being set up. That same afternoon, Karen returned, flanked by 2 men in HOA polos and a clipboard-wielding land consultant from a company Lucas had never heard of. We just want to clarify a few things, Karen said sweetly. There's been a lot of confusion. It's really in everyone's best interest to resolve this amicably. Lucas didn't invite them in. He stepped outside, closing the door behind him. I've reviewed all legal boundaries, he said calmly. There is no overlap. You have no jurisdiction here. Karen tilted her head. Boundaries evolve, Mr. Gray. This community is growing, and shared responsibility benefits everyone. Besides, isn't it better to be part of something bigger? Lucas's eyes narrowed. I didn't buy into this community. I bought land. You don't get to redraw lines just because they're inconvenient. The consultant, mid-30s, nervous, interjected. Technically, the updated plats filed 3 years ago may suggest an easement. Lucas cut him off. File whatever you want. You're not touching my land. Karen's expression soured, and for a brief moment, the mask slipped. The HOA president, the real one, peeked through. You're making this more difficult than it needs to be, she said quietly. We have legal avenues. You'd be wise to cooperate. Lucas said nothing. He didn't need to. The fire had already been lit. That night, he began documenting everything. Time-stamped photographs, copies of every letter, videos of HOA trucks hovering near his property line. He installed motion sensor cameras along the fence, created a digital backup of all property records, and made an appointment with a local land attorney named Veronica Hale, known for fighting HOA abuse cases. Veronica was blunt and brilliant. After scanning the HOA's claims and the maps they'd sent, she looked up and said, "This isn't incompetence. It's calculated. They've done this before." Lucas leaned in. "Can we stop them?" She nodded. "Oh, we will. But first, we need to know how deep this goes, because if they're shifting boundary lines, they've likely done worse." Over the next week, Veronica and her legal assistant dug through public records, zoning updates, and land use filings tied to Brookstone Ridge. What they found confirmed everything Lucas feared. 3 years ago, a revision to the HOA's land map had been quietly filed, without any public notification, and approved by a planning official who had since retired. That revision added several fringe properties, totaling nearly 10 acres, to HOA oversight. The kicker? All of them were privately owned lands that had never agreed to HOA governance. Lucas's property was the crown jewel. 5 pristine acres with hilltop views and development potential. They're trying to build a luxury clubhouse, Veronica said. But they need your land for access. Lucas's stomach turned. So this was never about fencing or paint colors. It's about money, Veronica nodded. Karen doesn't want your compliance. She wants your land. Fueled by anger but anchored by strategy, Lucas decided to turn the tables. He contacted Ellis, the retired surveyor, and asked for help locating the original township plat maps, the ones drawn up before the HOA even existed. Ellis, thrilled to help, pulled dusty records from storage, and met Lucas at the diner the next morning. What they found was conclusive. Not only was Lucas's land clearly outside HOA bounds, but the HOA had also forged an extension of a shared use trail right through the back edge of his property, claiming it was part of a public access easement. "This is fraud," Ellis muttered, shaking his head. Clear as day. Lucas scanned the maps, the signatures, the inconsistencies. He didn't need paint or canvas anymore. This was his masterpiece in the making, a different kind of composition, one built on truth and ready to be unveiled. He leaned back in the booth and said, "It's time to expose them. All of them." Because Lucas now understood something important. Karen wasn't just playing HOA politics. She was building a kingdom, and he had just found the fault line beneath it. Lucas Gray wasn't the kind of man who liked conflict, but he knew how to end one. In his younger years, he'd been a muralist, hired to paint stories on the sides of buildings. He spent months studying a neighborhood before putting brush to wall. He believed every battle, every triumph, every secret had a pattern. And right now, he was staring at the ugliest one he'd ever seen. Karen and her HOA board weren't just greedy. They were methodical. This wasn't their first attempt at a land grab. It was just the most ambitious, and Lucas was going to unravel it. He began with silence. While Karen continued sending threats masked as formal notices, Lucas stopped responding. He paid no attention to her friendly reminders or sudden invitations to coffee chats. Instead, he made quiet moves, all perfectly legal, and all impossible to trace until it was too late. With Veronica Hale's help, Lucas hired a licensed surveyor team to conduct a fresh third-party boundary assessment. It took 4 days, including drones, laser mapping, and a full terrain scan. When the results came back, they confirmed what Lucas already knew. The HOA's revised boundary map was fabricated, the easement claim was invalid, and worst of all, the land they attempted to seize was being included in a real estate investment deal with Brookstone Ridge Holdings, a shell company tied to Karen's husband. Veronica's voice was ice-cold on the phone. "They're leveraging your land as collateral for a project worth nearly $8 million. If that goes through, they'll have legal control of what they stole, and you'll be buried in years of litigation trying to take it back." Lucas said nothing at first, then quietly replied, "Not if we expose it before they sign." Phase 2 of his plan involved the residents. Lucas started attending HOA public meetings, not as a participant, but as an observer. He sat quietly in the back, taking notes, recording everything. He watched how Karen dismissed questions, how she interrupted anyone who disagreed, and how the rest of the board nodded along like trained dogs. At one meeting, an elderly resident named Martha Little raised concerns about surprise landscaping fees added to her dues. Karen brushed her off with a condescending smile. "Perhaps you should read the financial bulletins more carefully, Martha." Lucas leaned over and whispered, "You're not the only one she's treating like that." After the meeting, Martha approached him in the parking lot. "They raised my dues by $500 this year. Said it was for amenity upgrades. I haven't seen anything new except Karen's office got a renovation." Lucas smiled. "Would you be willing to say that on record?" In the weeks that followed, Lucas gathered testimonies from over a dozen residents, many of them elderly, single, or non-native English speakers. They'd all received mysterious fines, seen sudden changes in fees, and noticed Karen's personal life getting a little too lavish. One woman, Priya Desai, had footage of Karen's nephew using HOA landscaping trucks for his private lawn business. Another, Greg Holloway, found out that the approved HOA painters who overcharged him were linked to Karen's brother-in-law. Lucas began connecting dots faster than he could write them down. With Veronica's help, he compiled everything into a growing case file. Doctored land surveys, testimonies of financial coercion, HOA funds, misused shell companies, a web of nepotism and false contracts, and at the center of it all, Karen Whitmore. But Lucas needed more than evidence. He needed irrefutable proof that even Karen couldn't talk her way out of. So, he set a trap. He drafted a letter to Karen, saying he was ready to negotiate terms privately. He included vague hints that he might be willing to cooperate on development ideas in exchange for being left alone. Then he asked for a private dinner meeting. No lawyers, no HOA board. Just her and him. Karen agreed immediately. They met at a high-end restaurant on the edge of town. Karen arrived early, dressed in her trademark pastel blazer and pearls, smiling like she'd already won. "I'm glad you came to your senses," she said, sipping her wine. Lucas smiled politely. "I realized maybe there's a better way to handle all this." Karen leaned in. "You're smart. We're not enemies, Lucas. You're just new. And this community works best when everyone plays their part." She talked. And talked. And talked. What she didn't know was that Lucas had a legal audio recorder hidden in his jacket, approved by Veronica under the state's one-party consent law. Somewhere between dessert and Karen's second glass of wine, she said, "Let's be honest, Lucas. The landlines don't really matter. People forget. Records get cleaned up. And let's face it, who's going to believe a reclusive artist over the HOA board?" She laughed, touched his hand lightly. Lucas smiled. He had everything he needed. The next morning, Lucas and Veronica compiled the final version of the HOA misconduct report, a 93-page document complete with attachments, exhibits, testimonies, and transcribed audio. They sent it to the county recorder's office, the state's Department of Consumer Protection, 2 local news outlets, and every resident of Brookstone Ridge via anonymous Dropbox link. By the end of the day, the community's private Facebook group was on fire. "Is this real? She used our dues to renovate her personal office? They tried to take his land? We need an emergency meeting. Now." Lucas stood on his front porch that evening, watching the sun go down behind the ridge. He could feel it, the shift. The air was different. The fear was cracking. He took a deep breath. He wasn't done yet. But for the first time, Karen wasn't holding the brush anymore. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening. Normally, these meetings drew a handful of residents, mostly retirees with questions about lawn maintenance or noise complaints. But tonight, every seat was filled. People stood in the back, lined the walls, even spilled into the hallway outside the community center. Tension buzzed through the air like static before a lightning strike. Karen Whitmore walked in 10 minutes late, flanked by 2 board members and wearing a soft pink pantsuit, her signature color of friendly authority. She smiled as if nothing had happened, but the murmurs didn't stop. Not this time. She took her place at the head of the long table, adjusted the microphone, and gave her usual greeting. "Thank you all for coming. I know there's been some confusion recently, and we're here tonight to clear that up." Lucas stood at the back of the room. He wore jeans, a dark sweater, and a look of unshakable calm. Beside him was Veronica Hale, holding a black binder. Karen continued. "Now there have been certain documents circulating online. I want to assure everyone that these are taken out of context, and in many cases fabricated by someone with no understanding of how HOA operations work." "Then why were they signed by you?" someone called out. Karen blinked. "I'm sorry?" Lucas stepped forward. His voice was clear, steady. "The documents weren't fabricated. They were verified by 2 attorneys, a surveyor, and the county zoning office. Would you like to see the original easement map, the one your board doctored?" Gasps rippled across the room. Veronica stepped up, clicking a small remote. A portable projector cast a series of images onto the wall. Side-by-side comparisons of the original township plat and the forged HOA version filed 3 years earlier. "Let me be very clear," she said. "What you're seeing on the right is not a clerical error. It is a deliberate falsification of a legal boundary map for the purpose of absorbing private land into HOA jurisdiction without the owner's consent." Karen laughed nervously. "This is absurd. These images could be from anywhere." Lucas walked toward the front and placed a stack of signed affidavits on the table. "These are testimonies from 13 residents who were fined, bullied, or forced to comply with made-up violations. Some lost thousands. One was nearly evicted." Karen reached for her water glass with a trembling hand. Then Lucas dropped the final piece, a small speaker. He pressed play. Karen's voice filled the room. "Let's be honest, Lucas. The landlines don't really matter. People forget. Records get cleaned up. And let's face it, who's going to believe a reclusive artist over the HOA board?" Silence. You could hear the air leave the room. Lucas turned to the crowd. "She said that 2 weeks ago, over dinner, after suggesting I cooperate to avoid trouble, and she's not just targeting me." He nodded to the back, where Martha Little stood. Then Priya Desai, Greg Holloway, Robert from Lot 12. One by one they raised their hands. Ordinary residents, previously afraid to speak, now standing united. A man in a wheelchair rolled forward. "I'm the veteran who got fined $900 because my flagpole wasn't HOA approved." A young couple stood. "They told us to remove our solar panels or pay $25,100. An elderly woman lifted a thick manila folder. "I kept every letter, every photo of their people trespassing." Karen's facade crumbled. "This is a smear campaign," she snapped. "These people are disgruntled. They don't understand the responsibilities of leadership." Lucas held her gaze. "Leadership doesn't mean abuse. It means service, and you've been serving yourself." The room erupted in noise, shouts, demands, accusations. People began chanting, "Vote her out! Vote her out!" A motion was made, seconded, and passed on the spot. Karen Whitmore was officially removed as HOA president, effective immediately. 2 board members resigned on the spot. A third broke into tears and admitted she had no idea what Karen had really been doing. The remaining members voted to suspend all active violations, freeze the HOA bank account, and hire an independent auditor. Karen stormed out, her face flushed with fury and fear. But no one followed her. Not this time. Outside, the night air felt different, free. Lucas stood in the center of it, watching neighbors who had once avoided him now approaching with thanks, questions, apologies. "You saved this place," one man said. Lucas shook his head. "No, I just showed you what was already there. You saved it yourselves." The days after Karen's fall felt like a cleansing rain. For the first time in years, the community of Brookstone Ridge was truly awake. Gone were the whispers, the fear of letters in red ink, the quiet dread of HOA retaliation. In their place, open doors, conversations across driveways, and the long-overdue sound of neighbors rediscovering trust. The HOA board, now under temporary stewardship by 3 elected residents, moved quickly. With Veronica's legal help, they rescinded over $94,000 worth of unjust fines, refunded fraudulent fees, and formally re-established the original boundary lines of the community. Lucas's 5-acre property was finally, and officially, declared outside HOA control. But that wasn't all. A state-level investigation into HOA abuse, launched after Lucas's report, uncovered a web of real estate manipulation reaching into 3 nearby developments. Karen Whitmore faced multiple felony charges, including document forgery, fraud, and abuse of authority. Her husband's development firm was dissolved. Assets frozen. The clubhouse project canceled permanently. She was, quite literally, erased from the map she tried to redraw. Lucas, meanwhile, returned to his quiet rhythms. The barn became a studio again, filled with sunlight and the scent of oil paint and cedar wood. But something had changed in him. He no longer painted only for himself. Word spread of what he'd done, of how he stood up not just for his own land, but for everyone who had been silenced. A few neighbors asked if they could visit his studio. He said yes. Then someone asked if they could help repaint the barn. Then someone brought flowers. And then came the idea. It began small. Lucas set up a few easels on the south end of his property beneath the old pine trees. He invited residents, young and old, to come paint for free on weekends. No HOA, no rules. Just creativity, color, and community. Within weeks, that grove turned into a rotating outdoor exhibit. Children's art hung beside veterans' sketches. Formerly silenced neighbors painted images of freedom, of fences coming down, of homes reclaimed. He named it the Ridge Project, a tribute to the land they tried to take, and to the voices that finally took it back. One afternoon, as Lucas cleaned his brushes, Martha Little stopped by with lemonade. "You never did answer," she said. "Why fight this hard? You could have sold, walked away." Lucas looked out across the field, now filled with canvas, laughter, and wind chimes. "I didn't come here looking for a fight," he said. "But sometimes, a place finds you, and asks if you'll stand for it." She nodded. "Well, you did, and we stood with you." The next HOA meeting, held in the community center, opened with something new. A moment of silence. Not for loss, but for renewal. A quiet acknowledgement of how close they'd come to losing themselves, and how one man, with a brush and a backbone, helped them pull back from the edge. Lucas didn't attend that meeting. He was in the grove, helping a little boy draw his first tree, because peace isn't just found. Sometimes it's fought for, and sometimes the quietest people turn out to be the loudest echoes of change. Life lesson from the HOA land grab. This story reminds us that silence doesn't mean weakness, and that peaceful people can be powerful when pushed too far. Lucas didn't seek conflict. He sought calm. But when injustice threatened what was rightfully his, he chose not to run, but to rise, investigate, and act. Through patience, evidence, and community support, he stood against a corrupt system that had operated unchecked for years. In life, we often think it's easier to stay quiet to avoid confrontation, but real change begins when one person draws a line and says, "No more." Whether it's in your neighborhood, your workplace, or your relationships, you have the right to protect what is yours, and the power to inspire others to do the same. Lucas didn't just win a battle over land, he restored a community's voice. Stand up, speak truth, and never underestimate the impact of quiet strength. Love this story? Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more gripping HOA tales, powerful life lessons, and cinematic storytelling that hits home. Click the bell so you won't miss the next big twist, because some battles are too real not to be told.